The empire he had built was unshakable, until now. The news of the arrival of an unexpected heir brought fear, distrust, and a dark plot. But fate has a curious way of exposing secrets, and this horseback ride would change everything. Welcome to the channel. Before we begin, please like and subscribe so we can continue creating stories like this one. The sun mercilessly punished the extensive coffee plantations that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Richard Morrison observed his property from the high veranda of the main house, feeling a mixture of pride and possessiveness that only men who had built their own empire could understand. At 45, he had transformed the once abandoned and unproductive Rising Sun Ranch into the largest agricultural complex in the American Midwest. When I arrived here, there was nothing but red soil and promises, Richard commented to Frank, his trusted foreman for more than a decade. Now look, 5,000 acres producing more than any other farm across 3 states. It's true, boss. You achieved the impossible, replied Frank, maintaining the respectful posture that Richard demanded from everyone around him. Richard adjusted the wide-brimmed hat that protected his tanned, weather-marked face. His eyes, as dark brown as the coffee he produced, held a calculating gleam that caused discomfort in those who observed him for too long. His hands, calloused from the hard work of the early years, now rarely touched the soil, but still carried the strength of someone who wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty when necessary. In the center of Clearwater, the small town that had grown in the shadow of his ranch, Richard was seen as a local hero, the man who had created jobs and brought prosperity. Few knew what happened beyond the imposing gates of Rising Sun Ranch. Even fewer knew the true nature of the empire he had built. Elizabeth Morrison descended the stairs of the main house with the elegance of someone raised in the refined environments of the capital. At 32, her discreet beauty had captured Richard's attention during a charity event in Chicago 3 years earlier. The quick and widely publicized wedding represented for him another valuable acquisition, the missing piece to complete his image as a successful man. "Richard, we need to talk," said Elizabeth, approaching her husband cautiously. Her slender fingers nervously adjusted the collar of the light dress she wore. "Not now, Elizabeth. I'm resolving important matters with Frank." "It's about something that can't wait," she insisted, with an unusual firmness in her voice. Frank, sensing the tension in the air, discreetly backed away, muttering something about checking the operation of the new tractors. Richard watched the foreman walk away before turning his attention to his wife. "What's so urgent that it can't wait until dinner?" Elizabeth took a deep breath, her trembling hands now resting on her still flat belly. "I'm expecting a child, Richard." The words hung in the air like a sentence. Richard felt an icy wave run down his spine, a sensation he had experienced only once in his life, when he had almost lost everything in a fire that destroyed part of his first plantation. "What do you mean?" he questioned, his voice low and controlled, more threatening than if he had shouted. "I'm pregnant, we're having a baby," repeated Elizabeth, a small smile trying to form on her lips despite her evident nervousness. Richard maintained an impassive countenance, but inside, a storm was brewing. An heir had never been in his plans. His fortune, his empire, everything he had built with so much sacrifice would now be threatened by this unwanted child. Elizabeth knew he didn't want children. He had made that clear even before the marriage. For Richard, children meant division, meant loss of control. "I thought we were in agreement about this," he finally said, each word coming out like a cold stone. "I know we talked about this before, but it happened. And now, I'm happy, Richard. I thought you would be too. A child to continue your legacy." "My legacy?" he interrupted with a dry laugh. "My legacy is what I built with my own hands, Elizabeth. I don't need anyone to continue what I started." Elizabeth's hurt look didn't go unnoticed, but Richard was already too immersed in his calculations to consider his wife's feelings. His mind worked quickly, analyzing the new variable that threatened his meticulously laid plans. "We'll talk about this later," he finally said, turning to contemplate his property again. "I have matters to resolve now." Elizabeth withdrew silently, but not before noticing the subtle change in her husband's posture, the rigidity in his shoulders that always betrayed when something deeply disturbed him. In the following weeks, Richard's behavior became increasingly distant. While Elizabeth began preparations for the baby's arrival, transforming one of the empty rooms into a future nursery, her husband spent more and more time in the office or inspecting the most remote corners of the ranch. On a particularly hot afternoon, Richard found himself in the stables observing his favorite stallion, a magnificent black-coated animal that he had personally tamed years ago. Thunder, as he called it, was known for its indomitable spirit and for its exclusive loyalty to Richard. "This horse is worth more than many men out there, Frank," he commented, running his hand over the muscular neck of the animal. "You know why? Because he obeys without questioning. He understands his place." Frank merely agreed with a nod, already accustomed to the boss's philosophies that frequently compared people to animals. "You know what bothers me, Frank?" continued Richard, now brushing the stallion's mane. "When things get out of control, when perfect plans are threatened by unforeseen events." "Are you talking about the baby?" risked Frank, one of the few who could speak openly with Richard. "I'm talking about anything that threatens what I've built," he responded dryly. "Elizabeth knows I don't want to divide anything I have, nothing, and now she comes to me with this story. With all due respect, boss, a child is a blessing. Maybe it's time to think about the future of the ranch, about who will take care of all this when." "When I'm no longer here," interrupted Richard, his dark eyes fixed on the foreman. "You think I haven't thought about that? The difference is that I prefer to choose who will inherit the fruit of my work. A baby is an unknown, Frank. It can grow up and destroy everything I've built." The silence that followed was charged with tension. Frank knew he shouldn't insist on the subject. He knew the boss's temperament too well to risk provoking him. "Tomorrow I'll take Elizabeth to see the northern region of the property," declared Richard, abruptly changing the subject. "Prepare Thunder and the gentle chestnut for her. We'll leave at dawn." "Are you sure, boss, Mrs. Elizabeth, in her condition?" "My wife is pregnant, not an invalid," Richard cut him off. "Besides, she's constantly asking to see the full extent of the ranch. The time has come." Frank nodded, unable to argue, but an uncomfortable premonition settled in his chest as he watched the boss caress the powerful black stallion with a strange gleam in his eye. The morning dawned with a fine mist that covered the vast fields of Rising Sun Ranch. Elizabeth adjusted the straw hat that protected her delicate face, while Richard checked the saddles of the horses. She noticed the special care her husband dedicated to the imposing black stallion, Thunder, an animal that had always intimidated her with its size and wild temperament. "Are you sure I should go?" asked Elizabeth, gently caressing her belly. "I could see the property when I'm more prepared." Richard gave her an impatient look. "Don't be foolish, Elizabeth. The exercise will be good for you and the baby. Besides, I want to show you something special that few people know about, a place where I'm thinking of expanding our operations." There was something in his tone of voice that made her hesitate, but Elizabeth pushed away the uncomfortable sensation. Since the announcement of her pregnancy, 3 weeks earlier, she had been trying to interpret every gesture, every word from her husband as a sign of acceptance. Perhaps this trip was his way of getting closer, of finally including her in his plans for the future. Frank helped her mount the chestnut, a docile animal chosen especially for her. The foreman seemed tense, his eyes avoiding Elizabeth's when she thanked him. "Return before sunset, boss," he recommended, handing the reins to Richard. "Storm coming from the west, it'll be heavy." "Don't worry, I know these lands better than any man," replied Richard, adjusting his leather gloves. "If necessary, we can take shelter in the old observation post." The ride started peacefully. Richard guided them through perfectly aligned coffee fields, explaining with evident pride how each acre had been conquered, how each obstacle had been overcome. Elizabeth noticed that for the first time in weeks, her husband was speaking openly with her, like in the first days of marriage. "Before me, nobody believed this land could produce anything but weeds," Richard commented as they crossed a crystalline stream. "They said the soil was poor, that water was scarce, that I was crazy to invest here. But I saw what others couldn't see." "You've always had vision, Richard," agreed Elizabeth, genuinely admiring her husband's determination. "It's what has impressed me most about you from the beginning." A brief, almost imperceptible smile crossed Richard's lips. He rarely received, compliments that weren't motivated by interest or fear. "What we'll see today goes beyond what anyone has seen of this property," he stated, guiding her along a narrow trail that began to gradually ascend. "We're entering Eagle Ridge. This part of the ranch remains unexplored by most of the employees. As they advanced, the vegetation became denser and the terrain more rugged. Elizabeth held the reins firmly, occasionally feeling twinges of discomfort, but determined not to show weakness. She wanted to prove to Richard that she could be a partner worthy of his ventures, even with the pregnancy. "Is it safe to pass through here?" she asked, noting that the trail dangerously narrowed at the edge of a cliff. "Trust me," replied Richard, his tone gently authoritative. "I know every rock on this path." After almost 2 hours of riding, they reached a plateau that offered a spectacular view. On one side, the entire expanse of Rising Sun Ranch. On the other, the vertiginous abyss of Eagle Ridge, almost 300 feet deep. The wind blew stronger there, making Elizabeth's hair flutter when she removed her hat to better contemplate the landscape. "It's impressive," she whispered, genuinely amazed. "This is the highest point of the entire property," explained Richard, dismounting and tying Thunder to a sturdy shrub. "From here I can see everything I've built, and everything I still intend to build." Elizabeth also dismounted with some difficulty. She felt a slight dizziness when stepping on the ground and momentarily leaned on the chestnut. Richard pretended not to notice. "Come to the edge," he called, extending his hand. "From there the view is even more incredible." Elizabeth hesitated. The wind was increasing, and dark clouds were rapidly approaching from the west, confirming Frank's prediction. Something in her intuition told her not to approach the edge, but Richard's insistent gaze overcame her resistance. "Careful, the terrain is uneven," he warned, holding her by the arm as they walked to the edge of the cliff. In the distance, Thunder announced the proximity of the storm. Thunder whinnied nervously, pulling at the rope that held him. "Maybe we should go back," suggested Elizabeth, feeling the first raindrop hit her face. "The storm is coming." Richard didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, but his mind was calculating something completely different. Elizabeth noticed the change in his countenance, the same concentrated expression he displayed when facing a particularly challenging business problem. "Richard," she called softly, "are you okay?" "Have you ever thought about how much all this is worth, Elizabeth?" he asked finally, his gaze sweeping the property below them. "How much a lifetime of work is worth?" "I've never thought in terms of value," she replied sincerely. "I think of the meaning, the legacy we build." Richard smiled, a cold smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Legacy. You insist on that word, as if an empire were maintained by sentimentality." Elizabeth felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the wind or the rain that was now falling harder. "A child is more than sentimentality, Richard. It's continuity, it's a threat," he interrupted, his tone frighteningly calm. "A variable I can't control. You knew from the beginning that I didn't want this." The black horse whinnied louder, now restless, as if sensing something. Elizabeth took an instinctive step back, moving away from both Richard and the edge of the cliff. Her heart raced when she noticed her husband's look. Calculating, cold, determined. "Richard, you're scaring me," she said, her voice trembling. "What's happening?" "I'm just protecting what's mine," he replied, advancing a step in her direction. "What I've built will not be divided, will not be threatened." Panic took hold of Elizabeth when she understood her husband's true intention. The rain was falling more intensely now, turning the terrain into slippery mud. She tried to move away, but her boots lost traction on the soaked soil. "Richard, please," she begged, instinctively protecting her belly with her hands. "Think about what you're doing." "I've thought about it quite a bit," he retorted, advancing another step. "It's a necessary sacrifice." At that moment, lightning cut across the sky, followed immediately by the deafening roar of thunder. The black stallion, frightened, reared up and broke the rope that held him. In its desperation, the animal galloped toward them, whinnying furiously. Richard, distracted by the sudden movement of the horse, hesitated for an instant. It was enough for Elizabeth to find a last bit of strength. She turned abruptly, slipped in the mud and fell to her knees, but managed to crawl away from the edge of the abyss. "What do you think you're doing?" growled Richard, recovering from the initial surprise. "Saving our child," replied Elizabeth, her voice choked with emotion and physical exertion, "and saving you from committing the worst mistake of your life." With a quick movement, Richard grabbed Elizabeth's arm and pulled her violently. She screamed, more from surprise than pain, and tried to break free. In the brief struggle that followed, both slipped dangerously close to the edge of the cliff. It was then that Thunder, the black stallion that Richard was so proud of having tamed, appeared between them. The animal seemed possessed by an incomprehensible fury, rearing and whinnying as if wanting to protect Elizabeth. Confused and furious, Richard tried to calm the horse, but the animal pushed him with a sudden movement. A miscalculation. A misstep in the mud. A stronger gust of wind. Elizabeth couldn't pinpoint exactly what happened next. She only saw her husband lose his balance at the edge of the abyss, his eyes widening in panic as his arms flailed in the air, vainly seeking something to grab onto. Richard's scream was lost in the roar of the wind. Elizabeth, paralyzed with horror, couldn't move, couldn't extend her hand, couldn't do anything but witness her husband disappear into the precipice. The storm fell relentlessly on Eagle Ridge, while Elizabeth remained paralyzed, her body trembling, not only from the cold of the rain that soaked her clothes, but from the shock of what she had just witnessed. The reality of what had happened took time to infiltrate her consciousness. Richard, her husband, the man who had silently planned to eliminate her, had fallen into the abyss. Thunder approached her, his heavy breathing forming small clouds of vapor in the cold air. The immense black stallion, which had always shown hostility in her presence, now seemed almost protective, positioning itself between her and the edge of the precipice. Elizabeth extended a trembling hand and touched the wet neck of the animal. "What happened here?" she whispered, more to herself than to the horse. A thunderous roar brought her back to reality. The storm was intensifying, and she was alone at the most remote and dangerous point of the property. She needed to seek help, needed to return to the ranch headquarters. But how would she explain what had happened? Who would believe that Richard, Morrison, the powerful rancher respected by all, had tried to kill her? With difficulty, Elizabeth managed to mount the chestnut that had remained frightened but docile a few meters away. To her surprise, Thunder followed at her side, as if determined to escort her. The descent along the steep trail was slow and dangerous, the mud making each step of the horses a calculated risk. "We'll make it," Elizabeth murmured repeatedly, both to calm the animals and to maintain her own sanity. "We'll return safely." The rain began to diminish when they reached flatter terrain, but the sky remained laden with dark clouds. Elizabeth knew she should head for the ranch headquarters, but something inside her warned her of the danger. How would she be received? What would she say? Who could she trust? Making an instinctive decision, she guided the chestnut in a different direction, away from the main road. Thunder followed her pace as if approving the choice. Elizabeth knew of a small cabin used by the ranch hands during harvest time, situated at the opposite end of the property. Perhaps there she could take shelter while deciding what to do. The cabin was abandoned as she expected, since the harvest had ended weeks before. The modest interior, with a simple bed, a rustic table, and a wood stove, seemed luxurious to someone on the brink of physical and emotional exhaustion. Elizabeth tied the horses under a small attached roof, and with the last strength that remained, lit the stove to warm the environment and dry her clothes. While trying to organize her thoughts, images of what had happened returned in disturbing flashes. Richard's determined look, the feeling of betrayal upon understanding his intentions, the panic of fighting for her own life and for the life she carried within her, the terrible vision of her husband falling into the precipice. "I can't believe it," she murmured to the silence of the cabin. "How did I not realize before? How did I not see what he was capable of doing?" The tears finally came, not of sadness for the loss of her husband, but for the enormity of the situation in which she found herself. She was alone, pregnant, and would now be seen as the main suspect in the disappearance of one of the most powerful men in the region. Who would believe her version of the facts? Who would take her side against the empire that Richard had built? Fatigue eventually overcame her, and Elizabeth fell into an agitated sleep, populated by nightmares where she repeatedly fell into the abyss, only to wake up startled and find reality equally frightening. The morning brought with it the sound of distant voices and barking dogs. They had initiated the search for them. Elizabeth peeked through the cabin window and saw in the distance groups of men on horseback scouring the plains. They had not yet approached her hiding place, but it was only a matter of time. It was then that a plan began to form in her mind. She could not simply return and tell the truth. It would be her word against Richard's impeccable reputation. She would need time to think, to plan, to find a way to protect herself and the baby. With renewed determination, Elizabeth gathered what she could find in the cabin: some cans of food, an old canteen, matches, and a worn blanket. She tied everything into an improvised bundle and went out to check on the horses. The chestnut seemed exhausted, still trembling from the events of the previous day. Thunder, on the other hand, remained alert, as if waiting for her instructions. "You're going to help me, aren't you?" whispered Elizabeth, caressing the muzzle of the magnificent animal. "You're going to help me survive until I figure out what to do." As if understanding, the black stallion whinnied softly. Elizabeth made the decision. She would ride Thunder, the stronger and more resistant horse, and leave the chestnut free to return to the ranch. Perhaps this way they would gain some time, making the searchers believe that the storm had separated them. Before leaving, she wrote a brief note and left it attached to the chestnut's saddle. "Accident on the ridge. Richard fell. I'm injured, but alive. Seek help." It wasn't a complete lie, but it would give the impression that she was disoriented and injured, justifying her temporary disappearance. With a heavy heart, Elizabeth mounted Thunder and departed in the opposite direction, from the ranch toward the property line. She knew that on the other side there was a small village, River Haven, distant enough to not have strong ties with Rising Sun Ranch. There, perhaps, she would find temporary refuge to organize her next steps. The ride was slow and painful. Each jolt made her body protest, reminding her of the physical and emotional traumas of the previous day. But Elizabeth was determined to survive, now more than ever. It wasn't just her life she needed to protect. By late afternoon, she spotted the first simple houses of River Haven, a small fishing village on the banks of the Golden River. Exhausted and hungry, Elizabeth knew she couldn't simply appear as the wife of the powerful Richard Morrison. She would need a convincing story, something that explained her condition without revealing her true identity. At the entrance to the village, she dismounted from Thunder and carefully undid the bun that kept her hair tied. She let her brown hair fall over her shoulders, partially hiding her face. She deliberately dirtied her hands with soil and lightly rubbed it on her face, smudging any trace of makeup she might still have. Finally, she strategically tore the hem of her dress, creating the image of someone who had gone through difficulties. The first person she encountered was an elderly woman who was hanging clothes in the yard of a modest house. Upon seeing Elizabeth's state, the woman immediately dropped her work and ran in her direction. "My God, my child, what happened to you?" asked the woman, supporting Elizabeth, who pretended to stagger. "Accident. On the road," murmured Elizabeth with a purposefully weak voice. "My husband, don't know where he is. I'm pregnant. Please." She didn't need to say more. The natural compassion of the simple residents of River Haven manifested immediately. Soon, Elizabeth was taken inside the house, where she received water, food, and clean clothes. No one questioned her fragmented story. Everyone assumed she was in a state of shock. "My name is Mrs. Betty," introduced the elderly woman, while helping Elizabeth settle into an improvised bed in the living room. "You can stay here as long as you need, my child. My son-in-law, Tom, has already gone to inform the sheriff about you. Soon they'll find your husband, God willing." Elizabeth felt a twinge of guilt for deceiving such kind people, but she knew she had no choice. At least for now, she needed to remain hidden, away from the reach of Richard's trusted men. "Thank you," she responded with sincerity. "I don't know how to thank you." "What's your name, my child?" asked Mrs. Betty. Elizabeth hesitated for only a second before responding. "Sarah. My name is Sarah Wilson." The name of her mother, who had died years before, was the first that came to mind. From that moment, Elizabeth Morrison would disappear, giving way to Sarah Wilson, a pregnant widow in search of a fresh start. In the days that followed, Elizabeth recovered her physical strength while carefully constructing her new identity. She told Mrs. Betty and the few curious visitors who came to see her that she was from a distant town, that she had been traveling with her husband in search of work when they were surprised by the storm. The car had skidded on the muddy road, fallen into a ravine, and she had only managed to escape by a miracle. "And this horse?" asked Tom, Mrs. Betty's son-in-law, observing Thunder, who mysteriously remained close to the house, refusing to move away from Elizabeth. "I found him wandering alone after the accident," she lied. "It seems he decided to adopt me." News about Richard Morrison's disappearance reached River Haven a week later. The regional newspapers displayed his photo and reported the intense searches occurring at Rising Sun Ranch. They speculated about a possible accident during the ride, mentioning that his wife was also missing. Elizabeth discreetly observed the reactions of the residents as they read the news. No one, however, made the connection between the outsider Sarah Wilson and the wife of the powerful rancher. For the simple inhabitants of River Haven, Rising Sun Ranch was a separate world, as distant from their reality as the big cities. As the days passed, Elizabeth realized she had found a safe temporary refuge. She decided to remain there until the baby's birth, building a new life. She managed to get a job as an assistant at the small village school, using knowledge from her education degree that she had never been able to exercise during her marriage to Richard. Meanwhile, Thunder became a constant and protective presence. The black stallion, previously feared by everyone at the ranch except Richard, now showed itself surprisingly docile with Elizabeth. It was as if the animal understood that they shared a secret, a story that no one else knew. 6 months had passed since Elizabeth's arrival in River Haven. The small village on the banks of the Golden River had become her refuge, and the residents had welcomed her as one of their own. Her belly was now prominent, announcing the proximity of birth, and everyone treated her with special care, particularly Mrs. Betty, who had assumed the role of surrogate mother. The news of the discovery of Richard Morrison's body, 3 months after his disappearance, reached the village as a distant murmur. The regional newspaper reported that the body of the powerful rancher had been found in a remote area of Eagle Ridge, victim of an accidental fall. The article also mentioned that his wife, Elizabeth Morrison, remained missing, raising suspicions about her involvement in the incident. "What a sad story," commented Mrs. Betty, leafing through the newspaper during breakfast. "Such a rich and powerful man with everything in life, and he ends like this. And the wife, poor thing, missing. Do you think she's alive, Sarah?" Elizabeth felt a knot in her throat upon hearing the question. 6 months living as Sarah Wilson, and she was still surprised when she needed to lie. "Who knows?" she responded cautiously. "Maybe she found a new path, just like me." Mrs. Betty smiled with compassion, interpreting the response as a reflection on Elizabeth's own situation. "You're strong, my child. Rebuilding life after losing everything is not for everyone." The village was lively that morning. It was market day, when merchants from nearby towns brought different products and news from the outside world. Elizabeth, now an assistant teacher at the local school, had managed to save enough to buy material for the baby's layette. "I'm going to take a walk around the market," she announced, adjusting the straw hat that protected her face from the strong sun. "I need to buy thread and fabric to finish the blanket." "Don't tire yourself too much," recommended Mrs. Betty, "and take Tom with you to carry the purchases. In your condition, you can't be carrying weight." Elizabeth smiled, grateful for the genuine concern. In River Haven, she had found not only safety, but also a family she had never had. Tom, Mrs. Betty's son-in-law, had become like a protective brother, always willing to help her. The market was more bustling than usual. Colorful stalls extended across the central square, offering fruits, vegetables, fabrics, household utensils, and all sorts of trinkets. The buzz of conversations mingled with the sound of an accordion played by a traveling musician. Elizabeth walked slowly between the stalls, Tom at her side carrying the small shopping basket. She felt safe in this familiar environment, where everyone knew her as Miss Sarah, the pregnant widow who was starting life anew. That's when she saw him. A few meters away, examining tools at a stall, was Frank, Richard's trusted foreman. Her heart raced, and instinctively Elizabeth turned her face, pulling her hat down to hide her features. "Any problem, Sarah?" asked Tom, noticing her sudden discomfort. "I don't feel well," she murmured. "I think the heat is affecting me." "Can we go back home?" Tom immediately showed concern, offering his arm for support. As they moved away from the market, Elizabeth couldn't resist and looked back. Frank continued at the same stall, apparently without having noticed her. The relief was momentary, because she knew that his presence in the region meant that the search for Elizabeth Morrison had not completely ceased. Back at Mrs. Betty's house, Elizabeth pretended to recover from the malaise, but her mind was teeming with concerns. Frank's appearance was a cruel reminder that her past could reach her. At any moment, she needed to be more cautious. "Maybe it's time to consider moving to another town," she said, more to herself than to Mrs. Betty as they prepared dinner. "Why now, my child?" questioned the lady, surprised. "You're so well established here. The children at the school adore you, you have a safe roof, and when the baby is born, you'll have all our help." Elizabeth sighed, unable to explain her true fears. "I've been thinking about the future," she justified. "Maybe a larger town would offer more opportunities for me and the baby." Mrs. Betty studied her with a penetrating look, as if trying to read beyond the words. "You're running from something, aren't you?" she asked softly. "Or from someone?" The question caught Elizabeth by surprise. For a moment, she considered telling the whole truth to this woman who had welcomed her without questioning, but the fear of involving her in her complications made her pull back. "We all run from something, Mrs. Betty," she replied with a sad smile. "Sometimes from what we were, sometimes from what we could become." The conversation was interrupted by firm knocks on the door. Elizabeth's heart accelerated. Could it be Frank? Had he recognized her at the market after all? Tom entered the kitchen, his expression grave. "There's a man looking for you, Sarah," he announced, his voice low and tense. "Says he's from Rising Sun Ranch." Panic took hold of Elizabeth. Her worst fears were confirmed. Instinctively, her hand rested on her advanced belly as if wanting to protect the baby. "What does he want?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "He didn't say exactly. Said he needed to speak with a woman who matches your description. Said it's about a horse." Elizabeth took a deep breath. Thunder. The black stallion had become famous in River Haven not only for its impressive beauty, but also for its devotion to her. It was inevitable that eventually someone from the ranch would recognize it and follow its trail. "Where is he?" she asked, already knowing the answer. "Outside." "I didn't let him in until I spoke with you." Elizabeth realized she had no choice. Running away again would mean leaving behind the life she had built in the last few months, the safe shelter she had found, the people she had learned to love. But staying and facing her past could be even more dangerous. "Tell him I'm coming," she finally decided, "but please stay nearby." Before going out, Elizabeth took a small sewing scissors and hid it in the pocket of her apron. She didn't know what to expect from this encounter, but she wouldn't be unprepared like the last time. When she opened the front door, it wasn't Frank she found, but Paul, one of the horse handlers from the ranch. The middle-aged man, who had always been kind to her during her stay at Rising Sun Ranch, seemed equally surprised to see her. "Mrs. Elizabeth," he exclaimed, removing his hat in a sign of respect. "Is it really you?" "Hello, Paul," she replied, controlling her voice to not tremble. "What brings you here?" "We've been looking for you for months. Everyone thought you had—" He hesitated as if carefully choosing his words. "Been lost along with the boss in the storm." Elizabeth noticed Paul's gaze drop to her prominent belly and the surprise in his eyes. "How did you find me?" she asked directly. "It was because of thunder," explained the man. After they found Mr. Morrison's body, the search for you diminished. Many thought that, well, some said you might have fled after what happened to the boss. Elizabeth felt a chill. What exactly did people suspect? But I never believed that, continued Paul. You were always good to all of us. So when I heard talk of an extraordinary black horse in River Haven, identical to Thunder, I decided to check for myself. A brief silence followed, while Elizabeth considered her options. Paul didn't seem hostile, but she couldn't risk it. What do you intend to do now that you've found me? She finally asked. Paul seemed genuinely confused by the question. Do? I don't understand, Mrs. Elizabeth. I only came to make sure you were well. After everything that happened, everything. That happened, she repeated, cautious. The horse handler looked around, as if checking if they were alone before continuing in a low voice. After they found the boss, strange things started happening at the ranch. Mr. Victor, the lawyer, showed up with a will that nobody knew about. Said that since you were missing and probably, well, Mr. Morrison left everything for him to manage. Elizabeth frowned. Victor had always been Richard's trusted lawyer, but she had never imagined he could be involved in something so serious. And Frank? She asked, remembering the foreman she had seen at the market. He was fired 2 months ago, had an ugly argument with Mr. Victor when he questioned the will. Said there was something wrong, that the boss had never talked about leaving the ranch to anyone except... Paul stopped abruptly, seeming embarrassed. Except? Insisted. Elizabeth. Except for his child when he learned of your pregnancy, completed Paul, almost whispering. Frank said the boss was happy with the news, that he had changed his mind about having heirs, but nobody believed him. Everyone knew that. Mr. Morrison never wanted children. Elizabeth felt as if the ground opened beneath her feet. Frank's version completely contradicted everything she had experienced. Richard had never shown joy with the pregnancy. On the contrary, the news seemed to have awakened him to a dark decision that culminated in the murder attempt. That doesn't make sense, Paul, she said finally. Richard made it clear he didn't want this child. But I heard him myself, Mrs. Elizabeth, insisted Paul. On the morning before the ride, when I went to prepare the horses, the boss was in the stable with Frank, talking about making changes to the will as soon as they returned, to include the baby. He seemed happy. The revelation hit Elizabeth like a physical blow. Had she misinterpreted everything? Had Richard really changed his mind about the child? But then why had he taken her to the edge of the cliff with the clear intention of killing her? Why would Richard take me to the most dangerous point of the property if he was happy about the pregnancy? She asked more to herself than to Paul. The horse handler seemed confused. I can't say, Mrs. Elizabeth, I only know what I heard. And I know that Frank is convinced that there's something very wrong with that will. He's investigating on his own now that he no longer works at the ranch. Night had fallen over River Haven, bringing with it a cool breeze from the river. Elizabeth remained seated on the small veranda of Mrs. Betty's house, her eyes fixed on the horizon, while her mind processed the revelations brought by Paul. The horse handler had left hours before, promising to keep her whereabouts secret, but not without first relaying a message from Frank. I have proof. I need to find you. Any problems, my child? Mrs. Betty approached, carrying 2 steaming cups of tea. You've had that face ever since that man left. Elizabeth accepted the tea with a grateful smile. After 6 months of living together, she knew she could no longer hide the truth from the woman who had welcomed her like a daughter. I need to tell you something, Mrs. Betty, she began, her voice low and determined. My name isn't Sarah Wilson. My real name is Elizabeth Morrison, and the man I lost wasn't a simple traveler. He was Richard Morrison, owner of Rising Sun Ranch. Mrs. Betty's eyes widened, but Elizabeth noticed there wasn't true surprise in them. I suspected something like that, confessed the lady sitting beside her. The way you hide when someone from outside arrives, how you avoid talking about your past, and that magnificent horse, clearly not an animal belonging to common people. You knew and still welcomed me, protected me. It doesn't matter who you were, what matters is who you are, replied Mrs. Betty with simplicity. And the Sarah or Elizabeth I've known is a good person. I never doubted that. Tears came to Elizabeth's eyes, the emotion of finally sharing Her burden with someone who truly cared was overwhelming. "There's more, Mrs. Betty," she continued, wiping away the tears. "Richard, my husband, he tried to kill me that day. He took me to the edge of a precipice on Eagle Ridge during the storm because he didn't want the baby. He didn't want an heir to his fortune." Mrs. Betty brought her hand to her mouth, horrified. "My godchild, how did you escape?" "Thunder," replied Elizabeth, looking to where the black stallion rested under a nearby tree. "Richard's horse, for some reason I'll never understand, protected me. He interfered when Richard tried to push me, and in the confrontation, it was Richard who ended up falling." A heavy silence followed the revelation. Elizabeth expected to see fear or disapproval in the elderly woman's eyes, but found only compassion. "You didn't push him then, it was an accident." "Yes, I was only trying to defend myself, protect my child. I never wanted him to—" Elizabeth couldn't complete the sentence. Despite everything, the image of Richard falling into the abyss still tormented her in nightmares. And now this man who came today, what did he want? Elizabeth told her about Paul, about the supposed will, about the allegations that Richard was happy about the pregnancy, about Frank's suspicions. "I don't know what to think anymore, Mrs. Betty," she confessed. "If Richard had really changed his mind about the baby, why take me to that dangerous place? Why try to do what he tried?" Mrs. Betty reflected for a moment before answering. "When powerful men do bad things, there's always someone benefiting. Who would get everything if both you and your husband disappeared?" The question hit Elizabeth like lightning. It was so obvious, but her mind had been so focused on Richard's betrayal that she had never considered the possibility of a larger conspiracy. "Victor," she murmured, "the lawyer. He was always close to Richard's business, always knew everything." "And this Frank, what does he really know?" questioned Mrs. Betty. "He said he has proof." Elizabeth suddenly stood up, a decision forming in her mind. "I need to find him. I need to know the truth, for me and for my child." That night, Elizabeth could barely sleep. Her mind spun with possibilities, with plans, with fears. By morning, her determination was firm. She would find Frank and discover what he knew. But fate had other plans. The first contractions began before dawn, waking her with their relentless intensity. The baby apparently had decided its time had come. The following hours passed in a blur of pain and determination. Mrs. Betty, who had helped bring dozens of children into the world in the village, took command of the situation with calm efficiency. Tom was sent to fetch the midwife, while his wife, Jenny, prepared hot water and clean sheets. At noon, between cries of pain and words of encouragement, a healthy boy came into the world, with strong lungs and dark hair like his father's. When the midwife placed him in her arms, Elizabeth felt a wave of love so intense that all doubts and fears momentarily dissipated. "What will you name him?" asked Mrs. Betty, watching the scene with emotion. Elizabeth studied the small face, recognizing Richard's features but also something completely new and unique. "Matthew," she decided. "His name will be Matthew." 4 days had passed since Matthew's birth. Elizabeth was recovering slowly, dividing her time between caring for the newborn and planning her next steps. Paul's presence in River Haven meant that Victor would eventually discover her whereabouts. She needed to act before that happened. It was on the 5th night after the birth, while nursing Matthew in the silence of the early morning, that Elizabeth heard a familiar whinny. Thunder, who always remained in the vicinity of the house, seemed agitated. Moments later, discreet knocks sounded at the back door. With her heart racing, Elizabeth placed Matthew in the improvised crib and headed to the kitchen, where she found Tom already awake, a hunting rifle in his hands. "Don't answer," he whispered. "It could be dangerous." "I need to see who it is," insisted Elizabeth. "It could be important." Cautiously, she approached the door. "Who's there?" she asked, her voice firm despite the fear she felt. "Frank, Mrs. Elizabeth," came the response, in a low voice. "I came alone. We need to talk." Elizabeth exchanged a look with Tom, who reluctantly nodded. "I'll keep the gun ready," he murmured. "Any suspicious movement?" Elizabeth opened the door slowly. There was Frank, Richard's former foreman, looking thinner and more tired than she remembered, but with the same direct and honest look that had always inspired confidence. "Come in," she invited, stepping aside to give him passage. Frank entered, removing his hat in a sign of respect. His eyes quickly scanned the environment until they rested on Tom and his rifle. "I didn't come to cause problems," he assured slightly, raising his hands. "I just need to speak with Mrs. Elizabeth. It's urgent." "It's all right, Tom," said Elizabeth. "Can you leave us to talk alone?" Reluctantly, the man agreed, but not before casting a warning look at the visitor. "I'll be in the next room if you need me." When they were alone, Elizabeth indicated the kitchen table for them to sit. "Paul said you have proof," she began directly. "Proof of what exactly?" Frank stared at her intensely before responding. "That Mr. Morrison never had any intention of killing you, Mrs. Elizabeth, and that the will presented by Victor is false." The statement was so contrary to everything Elizabeth had experienced that she almost laughed. "Richard took me to the edge of a precipice during a storm, Frank. He tried to push me. I saw it in his eyes." "No, Mrs. Elizabeth," Frank shook his head vehemently. "What you saw was a man realizing he had fallen into a trap. Mr. Morrison received a letter that morning, supposedly from an old business partner, setting up a meeting at that specific point on the property. The letter mentioned a threat to your safety and the baby's. He decided to check the location before the appointed time, taking you with him because he believed it would be safer than leaving you alone at the headquarters." Elizabeth felt her blood freeze in her veins. "How can you know this?" Frank removed from his pocket a folded and worn paper, extending it to Elizabeth. "This is the letter. I found it among his belongings after the accident. And this," he continued, removing another document, "is the real will signed on the eve of the ride, leaving the entire ranch to the child who was to be born, with you as guardian until the child reached adulthood." With trembling hands, Elizabeth examined the documents. The letter, written in elegant calligraphy, detailed a threat against her and the baby, demanding that Richard come alone to the highest point of Eagle Ridge. The will, in turn, was clearly signed and notarized, dated the day before the tragedy. "I don't understand," murmured Elizabeth, confused. "If he wanted to protect us, why didn't he tell me about the threat? And why did he try to push me off the cliff? Mr. Morrison was a reserved man, you know that. He probably didn't want to alarm you in your condition. As for what happened at the cliff," Frank hesitated, choosing his words. "Witnesses saw Victor riding toward the ridge that morning. I believe he was hidden, watching, waiting for the right moment. Perhaps Mr. Morrison saw him and tried to move you away from danger." The implications of what Frank suggested were monumental. If he was telling the truth, Elizabeth's entire understanding of that fateful day would be transformed. Richard wouldn't have tried to kill her, but rather protect her. And the real villain would be Victor, who had orchestrated everything to eliminate both Richard and her, thus gaining total control of the ranch. "Victor has sufficient resources and influence to forge a will," continued Frank. "He has contacts at the notary's office, friends in the judiciary, but he didn't count on me finding the original document or looking beyond the obvious." "And why did you do that, Frank?" questioned Elizabeth, still cautious. "Why care so much about discovering the truth?" The man lowered his gaze as if ashamed. "Because I suspected from the beginning, Mrs. Elizabeth. I noticed how Mr. Morrison changed after he learned of the pregnancy. At first, yes, he was reluctant, but in the last days, he was different. Lighter, almost excited. He talked about the future, about expanding the house, about building a true legacy, and mainly because he hesitated again, because Victor offered me money to confirm that I saw him upset in the days before the accident, to testify that he had mentioned not wanting the baby." A soft cry interrupted the conversation. Matthew had awakened. Elizabeth rose hastily to attend to him, returning moments later with the little one in her arms. Frank looked at the baby with a softened expression. "He has his father's eyes," he commented. Elizabeth studied her son, noticing for the first time the undeniable resemblance. The truth was beginning to settle in her mind, along with the enormity of what she would need to face. "What do you suggest we do now?" she asked. "We need to take these documents to the county judge," replied Frank, determined. "But it won't be easy. Victor is powerful, has many allies. We'll have to be careful." Elizabeth looked at the son in her arms, feeling a new strength grow within her. She was no longer fighting just for her survival, but for her son's right, for the legacy that Richard had apparently wanted to leave. And more than that, for truth, for justice. "Let's do this," she decided, her voice firm. "We need more allies. Alone, we won't stand a chance against Victor." "Who do you have in mind?" asked Frank. "Paul, to start. He knows the ranch and seems loyal. And there are others on the property who can testify about Richard's change in behavior in the last days. But we also need someone with influence." Frank reflected for a moment before slowly nodding. "Dr. Lewis," he suggested, "the doctor who treated Mr. Morrison when he burned his arm in last year's harvest fire. He's respected throughout the region and never intimidated before anyone, not even Mr. Morrison." Elizabeth agreed. She remembered the doctor, an elderly man of firm principles who had treated Richard when he was injured, trying to save part of the harvest during an accidental fire. "He visited me at the ranch several times to monitor. For the pregnancy," she recalled. "He seemed honest to me." "He's the right man to help us," confirmed Frank. "And if I may suggest, you should return to the ranch, not hidden, but openly, with your son in your arms. The impact of your appearance, the boy's resemblance to Mr. Morrison, that will cause a commotion that Victor won't be able to easily control." The suggestion was frightening, but Elizabeth recognized its logic. Running and hiding had been necessary when she thought Richard had tried to kill her, but now with the possibility that he had truly loved her, that he had wanted to protect her and their son, the scenario completely changed. "I'll need a few days," she said, looking at Matthew, who slept peacefully in her arms. "The baby is too small for a long journey, and I myself am still recovering." "1 week," agreed Frank. "I'll use that time to gather more evidence and prepare our allies. When everything is ready, I'll come for you." The plan was laid out. Elizabeth felt a mixture of fear and determination, but knew she had no choice. For Matthew, for what could have been Richard's genuine love in the end, and for justice, she would confront Victor and his lies. A week later, exactly as agreed, Frank returned to River Haven. He brought with him a comfortable carriage for the transport of Elizabeth and Matthew, and encouraging news. Dr. Lewis had agreed to help them, and other ranch employees were willing to testify about Richard's change in attitude in the days preceding the tragedy. The farewell to Mrs. Betty was emotional. The elderly lady, who had become a second mother to Elizabeth, insisted on preparing protection amulets for the baby and insisted that they return to visit her when everything was resolved. "You will always have a home here, my child," she assured, embracing Elizabeth tightly. "You and little Matthew." The return to Rising Sun Ranch was, as Elizabeth and Frank had predicted, impactful. The carriage crossed the main gates at noon, when the workers were returning from the field for lunch. The sight of Elizabeth, whom everyone thought was missing or worse, carrying a baby in her arms, spread like wildfire. In minutes, a small crowd formed around the carriage. Familiar faces, some disfigured by surprise, others illuminated by smiles of relief, surrounded Elizabeth as she descended with Matthew in her arms. "It's Mrs. Elizabeth. She's alive. And she brought the boss's son. Look how he resembles Mr. Morrison." The comments multiplied, creating a buzz that grew with each moment. It was at this moment that Victor appeared on the veranda of the main house, alerted by the commotion. His face visibly paled upon recognizing Elizabeth. "What does this mean?" he asked, hastily descending the stairs, trying to maintain his composure. "Elizabeth, I thought you were dead," she completed, her voice clear and firm, carrying Matthew so that everyone could see the baby. "I'm sorry to disappoint you, Victor. I'm very much alive, and this is Matthew, legitimate son of Richard Morrison and heir to everything we see around us." A murmur ran through the crowd. Victor nervously looked at the faces surrounding them, seeking a way out of the unexpected situation. "Elizabeth, what a wonderful surprise," he tried, forcing a smile. "We all thought you had been lost during the accident. Why don't we go? inside and talk privately. You must be exhausted from the journey." "There will be no more private conversations, Victor," replied Elizabeth, standing firm. "Everything will be said here before witnesses, including how you forged Richard's will to take control of the ranch." The lawyer's face momentarily contracted before recovering the mask of calm. "What absurdity is this? The will was duly recognized by a notary. Richard left clear instructions." "Forged instructions," intervened Frank, stepping forward with the documents he had shown Elizabeth. "The real will is here, dated 1 day before Mr. Morrison's departure for Eagle Ridge, leaving everything to his yet unborn child." Victor laughed, a forced and nervous laugh. "And you expect anyone to believe in a paper presented by the fired foreman? Please, this is ridiculous." "Perhaps they won't believe him," said a new voice, and everyone turned to see Dr. Lewis approaching. "But they will believe me. I was the one who witnessed the signing of that will. Richard called me especially for this, saying he had changed his mind about many things after learning about the pregnancy." The crowd began to murmur louder. Victor looked from side to side, visibly cornered. "This proves nothing," he insisted, but his voice no longer carried the same conviction. "Elizabeth could have forged this document after what she did to Richard." A tense silence followed the veiled accusation. Elizabeth took a step forward, her eyes fixed on Victor. "What exactly are you accusing me of, Victor? Of causing Richard's fall? Interesting you mention that, when we know you were seen riding toward the ridge that morning." More murmurs now, with tones of indignation. Paul, the horse handler, stepped forward. "It's true, I saw Mr. Victor leaving early in the direction of the ridge. I thought it strange as he rarely rode horseback." Victor began to back away, his look now frankly frightened. "This is a conspiracy," he accused, his voice trembling. "You're all against me." It was at this moment that Thunder, the magnificent black stallion that had faithfully followed Elizabeth since the day of the tragedy, advanced through the crowd, approaching her and the baby. The animal positioned itself at her side like a silent guardian, its intelligent gaze fixed on Victor. The image was powerful. Elizabeth, the baby in her arms, and Richard's horse, an unlikely trio that somehow seemed to complete a circle of justice. "I think Thunder also has something to say about who's telling the truth," commented Frank with a slight smile. Cornered, Victor did what desperate people usually do. He tried to flee. He ran toward a horse tied near the house, but before he could reach it, several ranch workers blocked his path. "Not so fast, Mr. Victor," said one of them, a burly man whom Elizabeth recognized as the barn chief. "I think you have a lot of explaining to do." That same afternoon, the county sheriff was called. The evidence presented: the original will, witnesses who confirmed Richard's change in behavior, the suspicious letter setting up the meeting on the ridge, testimonies about Victor's presence in the area on the day of the tragedy was sufficient to initiate a formal investigation. Meanwhile, Elizabeth resumed her place in the main house. The nursery she had begun to prepare before the tragedy was finally completed, and Matthew came to occupy the crib that his father had specially ordered for him, a fact that Paul revealed, further confirming the change in Richard's feelings. The following weeks brought even more revelations. A search of Victor's properties found documents detailing a plan to divert money from the ranch over the years. Richard, apparently, had begun to suspect weeks before his fall, which explained some of his secret meetings and distant behavior. The investigation also revealed that Victor had hired a man to send the fake letter, and possibly to create a distraction on Eagle Ridge that would result in a fatal accident for the couple. But the plan had gone out of control when Thunder interfered, resulting only in Richard's fall. 3 months after Elizabeth's return, the judge validated the original will, recognizing Matthew as the legitimate heir to all of Rising Sun Ranch, with Elizabeth as legal guardian until his adulthood. Victor, meanwhile, awaited trial in the county jail, accused of fraud, document forgery, and conspiracy. On a sunny afternoon, Elizabeth sat on the same veranda where Richard used to contemplate his empire. Matthew, now 4 months old, played in her lap, his eyes, so similar to his father's, absorbing the world around him with infinite curiosity. Thunder grazed peacefully near the house, occasionally raising his head to observe them, as if standing guard. The black stallion, previously known for its wild temperament, had become the constant protector of Elizabeth and Matthew, to the amazement of everyone at the ranch. "Your father would be proud," murmured Elizabeth to the baby, caressing his dark hair. "He wanted you to have all this after all." Matthew gurgled in response, his small hand grasping one of his mother's fingers with surprising strength. Frank approached, respectfully removing his hat. "The new tractors have arrived, Mrs. Elizabeth, and the expansion of the northern area is progressing as planned." "Thank you, Frank," she responded with a smile. As ranch administrator, a position Elizabeth had insisted he assume, Frank had proven himself as competent as he was loyal. As the sun began to set on the horizon, painting the vast fields of Rising Sun Ranch in gold, Elizabeth reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her there. From frightened wife to independent and strong woman, from victim to survivor, from fugitive to respected leader. The truth about Richard remained complex in her mind. The man she had known in the years of marriage, controlling, cold, calculating, contrasted with the man who had apparently transformed in the last days, excited with the prospect of being a father. She would never know with certainty what had passed through his mind in those final moments at the edge of the precipice, but she chose to believe that, in the end, he had really wanted to protect her. Thunder approached the veranda, its imposing presence a constant reminder of the day that had changed everything. Elizabeth extended her hand and caressed the animal's muzzle, feeling the inexplicable connection that united them. "Thank you," she whispered, as she frequently did when they were alone. "For me, and for Matthew." The black stallion whinnied softly, as if understanding. Life continued, with all its complexities and twists, and Elizabeth Morrison, who had once feared losing everything, had discovered that her greatest strength lay in her capacity to survive, to begin anew, and to build a future worthy of the son she carried in her arms. As the first stars appeared in the sky, she made a silent promise to Matthew, to herself, and perhaps even to Richard, wherever he might be. Rising Sun Ranch would be not just an empire of land and production, but a true home, built on values that no fortune could buy. Dear listeners, we hope that Elizabeth's journey has touched your hearts. A mother's determination to protect her child, the search for truth, and the courage to face the past are themes that resonate in all of us. To continue this emotional journey, we've prepared a special playlist with equally captivating stories. Find it right here by clicking on the icon to the left. If you enjoyed this narrative, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and leave your like on the video. Every day we bring unique stories that explore the complexity of life, family bonds, and the surprising twists of fate. What did you think of the outcome? Had Richard really changed, or was it all a coincidence of fate and Thunder's mysterious behavior? Share your theories in the comments. We're eager to read your opinions. Until the next story, where once again, reality will prove to be more surprising than fiction.